Seminar. Today, like most days, we're gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. And we're all at different stages of learning and reflections around what this means for how we behave on the land, what we take from it, what we give back, what it means for our work, perhaps. I will share that one of my recent reflections is around how to think about relationship with people on the land and not just a relationship with the land. So I've had the opportunity to care for a little piece of land and thinking about how I developed this, but being an introvert doing that in isolation. And so you miss sort of the richness of the entirety of the relations. And so trying to think a little bit through that as I'll say, a common set of relations rather than one-on-one relationships. Today, we have the great pleasure of having Dr. Holly Caggiano here with us to give the seminar. Holly, and my notes went away, sorry. Holly completed a PhD in planning and public policy from Madras University. She then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton in the Behavioral Science for Policy Lab. And she joined UBC last year. She's appointed in SCARP, sorry. It is already her third semester teaching. I'm impressed. And I will let her introduce her research. I just wanted to point out that last year she co-authored a paper on advances in qualitative methods in environmental research. And I think that it's a great read. And if you're interested in that, I suggest that you read it. And if you have any thoughts, I'd be happy to chat about it as well. Please join me in welcoming Holly today.
Thank you so much. That was a very generous introduction and thoughtful to mention that paper. Getting hooked up. How does that sound? Okay. Wonderful. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new ones. I'm excited to be here. I joined SCARP last year. And so as many of you know, whenever you join SCARP, it takes a long time to kind of get acclimated and meet all of the interesting people that you'd like to meet. So I've been excited to engage more with IRES and learn from some of you as well. So very happy to connect about future research and chat more. So today, the title of my talk is Opposition or Opportunity, the role of community benefits in just energy transitions. And I will talk a little bit about some work that's been recently completed and that I did as a postdoc with some collaborators at Princeton University and now Stanford. And then some new work and where I'm thinking that this is heading, which I'm excited to talk about. Some of this I've talked about a lot, but that's stuff I haven't had a chance to talk about yet. So my work is mostly situated in the US, where I came from, kind of thinking about how much of this translates to Canada. Now have been thinking through that, and I think most of it is also true in a lot of ways. But right now, thinking about the US as a backdrop, it's a really critical moment for renewable energy development. The Inflation Reduction Act passed in August of 2022, and that came with a lot of money and a lot of incentives for building renewable energy. Within 7 months of its passage, there was already about $150 billion in utility scale renewable energy announced, which represented a big jump from what we had been seeing on a yearly basis, which is very important as we all know to meeting our climate goals. However, at the same time, building big projects is hard. It's not always easy to get something built at the utility scale. We often think about maybe rooftop solar or small scale community solar, but these large scale projects that generate a lot of energy to power a lot of homes and industry are a bit more difficult. Between 2008 and 2021, one study found that there were at least 53 utility scale renewable energy projects across 28 US states that were blocked because of some kind of delay or opposition, very often some kind of local opposition. But this stands in contrast to what we know about support for renewable energy projects, which is that they're quite popular. So you can see on one side, findings from a Pew Research poll that really a majority of Americans are prioritizing renewable energy, think about it as a top issue, maybe if not a voting issue, still an issue that's very important. They broadly support steps to address climate change, and I'll talk a little bit about political polarization in the US, but even despite that, it's broadly popular. However, lots of individual projects are facing local resistance. And so what I argue, and I make this argument to a lot of planners since I'm in a planning school, but I think is broadly important, is we often think about planning for energy transitions at the national level when we think about national goals, how much we need to reduce our energy by. These are important, but I think a lot of this is actually playing out at the local level. And so in the US, and this is also true in Canada, for the most part, siting authority varies state by state, but it typically rests at the local level. Some states have provisions that have jurisdiction over projects at a certain size, but for the most part, individual towns, cities are making decisions about where, when, and how to site projects. So in addition to the local level being important, you think, okay, well, who are the stakeholders? Local elected officials are incredibly important because they play a role in doing things like developing zoning rules, soliciting community feedback, either before projects are built, visions for a community, or once projects are proposed, and negotiating community benefits that can come with individual projects and energy transitions more broadly. So kind of the assumption that I make in coming to this work is that in order to rapidly build out the energy infrastructure that we need to meet our climate mitigation goals, it requires not only public support, which some of that research shows that we have, but also political will and capacity across levels of government. So first, I'm going to talk about a little bit of my recent work, which I'm excited that it was recently published, that talks about what drives public and local elected official preferences for large-scale energy projects where they live. And then also, how do local elected officials perceive public support for projects? And I did much of this work in Pennsylvania, and especially the survey that I will talk to you about first. It was in Pennsylvania, and it just so happened that Pennsylvania is now, if you've been paying attention to US news and elections, been a very hot topic. So I didn't plan that. It's a hot topic for many of the same reasons that it was a state that I did this work in, but it's been a little bit of an interesting time to talk about it. So a little bit of background on Pennsylvania. It's in the northeast of the US. And it's interesting for a lot of reasons that I'll talk about in a few slides. But the first is that it's a home rule state. It's actually a commonwealth. It has hyper local siting decisions. I think kind of a principle of the state is that decisions should be made at the local level wherever they can. So it's a little bit unique in that respect, but much of the US and much of Canada does make these decisions at a local level. In addition, there's been some recent work that looks at zoning ordinances and found that in Pennsylvania, it was something like 80% of the existing municipal zoning ordinances didn't have anything to say about wind or solar, which is not always a bad thing, but does make things less clear for developers. In terms of political polarization, it is a swing state, which is why one of the reasons that it has been a big issue in terms of the presidential campaigns. But I really like this map from the American Communities Project that they have their own kind of characterizations of the different counties across the state. And I do this to show that while if you think of Pennsylvania, but you're not very familiar, you might think of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. You see in the pink, Philadelphia, you see the big city. There are also a couple of college towns. Penn State, there's a lot going on around there, but much of the state in that teal blue is really represented as rural middle America. So it's a bit of an interesting place because although it has a large urban center and lots of people living around Philadelphia and in the suburbs around it, there's a fair bit of the state that is agricultural and quite rural. So The next reason that I chose to focus on Pennsylvania is because I was working at Princeton at the time and was working with the team that did the Net Zero America project, which is exciting. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend taking a look. It shows 5 distinct pathways that the US can take to reach net zero emissions by 2050 under different sets of assumptions. So I show one of them here with high renewable energy development, and I show Pennsylvania, but I think it's quite an interesting study. And when I started collaborating with that team and talking about the project, I thought this is really exciting because to me, what it shows is that in terms of land use, in terms of technology, and in terms of economics, we have what we need to make the transition. And they show 5 different pathways that are not the only pathways. They are just 5 different models with different sets of assumptions, which to me was very exciting. But like I said about the local level, I kind of thought, I think that this is a problem and something that we need to talk about, and these downscaled versions of those models are really helpful for that. So what you see here is Pennsylvania in 2020. You can see that there's in blue a little bit of wind energy, and under one of the Net Zero America scenarios, what Pennsylvania could look like in 2050. And you see very striking is all of that red is solar PV. So it's quite a big expansion. You know, this is again not the only model, but under one model, what Pennsylvania could see. And it's quite a lot, and we're already starting to kind of see that build out in practice. And that's around, you know, lots of other kind of competing things that are competing for land use. And then the final reason that I think Pennsylvania is very interesting and is also coming up, you know, across political debates right now is their legacy of energy extraction. There's this book at the bottom that Black and Ladson called it a symbolic battleground for America's transition away from fossil fuels, and I think that feels right for the time. But what you'll see is, you know, it's been a site of lots of energy extraction from petroleum wells, and this picture's from the 1860s, to fracking, drilling for gas in the Marcellus Shale, which is going on at present, has been a big topic of debate. Pennsylvania was also home to 3 Mile Island, the nuclear partial meltdown, and now is, you know, a growing site for renewable energy, particularly solar. And what, spending a lot of time in the area, what I'd been seeing on the ground, I'll talk about some survey research today, but I've also done lots of qualitative work on the ground, are, despite seeing, again, this kind of broad sentiment for that renewable energy is a good thing and probably quite good for the economy and gives farmers maybe some more options to diversify their incomes, individual projects were highly contested despite this popularity. And so I think that many of these individual projects and the discourse around them are framed around specific risks and benefits that they can bring to communities. Much of them do have to do with the preservation of farmland. Some have to do with aesthetics, but they are quite kind of community specific, and you do see a lot of people kind of showing up to local meetings against specific projects. And so to investigate this, we ran I almost said nationally representative, state representative survey in Pennsylvania to look at what project characteristics influence support or opposition to particular projects. We looked at these couple of areas: distance from residential areas, employment opportunities, local benefits, ownership structure, their site type, and their fuel type. And then we also looked at how do local elected officials perceive public support. So we did this with conjoint experiments, which I think is a quite nice way to do them. If you've seen any kind of like market research surveys, like iPhone 1 or iPhone 2, one is black, the other one is silver, one has this much data storage, the other one is this one. It's kind of like that, and tries to mimic a little bit more of real world decision making rather than just asking somebody straight out, you know, do you support this project or not? And conjoint experiments allow for causal conclusions because they generate these random bundles of attributes. So they're randomized, and then respondents see a sample that looks like that and have to make a couple of decisions about these. We did the survey with about 900 residents in Pennsylvania and about 200 local elected officials, which to me was the really exciting part. Not an easy group to survey, but the company Civic Pulse in the US does a really fabulous job with that. So I will not ask you to look at the small chart. I will pull things out. But this is the kind of overall model in terms of what we think, what matters to residents. And so the black dots, and they'll get bigger, but represent the average component marginal effect, which is the average causal effect of each attribute's level of support, of each attribute on the level of support for the project compared to a baseline attribute. So holding all other elements constant. So this will make sense when I talk about it. But for methods folks, it's essentially a fancy regression. It's an OLS with a fixed effect per order and clustered standard errors at the respondent level. And so I can kind of illustrate how this works in practice when we look at starting with distance from residential areas. And I won't talk about every attribute. I'll talk about the ones that are the ones that had some interesting findings or statistical significance. Distance from residential areas is one of those things that we would expect to make quite a difference. I think you can see kind of compared to some of the other categories, maybe not as much as we would think. So the way that you interpret this is that compared to a project that's 2 miles away from residential areas, that decreases project support by 7 percentage points compared to the reference category, which is the blacked out with no confidence intervals that's on the bottom. And so each has a reference, each attribute has a reference category in terms of distance. You're comparing that to this baseline of 50 miles away. So compared to a project that's 50 miles away from residential areas, if you tell somebody that it's 2 miles away, it only decreases support by 7 percentage points, which was less than I would expect. I think a particularly important category, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in terms of the framing of the paper around the importance of community benefits, is jobs. And this is not surprising because it has been a big part of the conversation, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania that's facing job losses due to the decline of other extractive economies, closing coal plants, closing fossil fuel infrastructure is associated often with job loss. So we asked about projects that create permanent jobs, create temporary jobs, as we think of a lot of renewable projects tend to do, rather than long-term permanent, or decreased number of jobs. And both increasing permanent jobs and decreasing total number of jobs, both respectively increased and decreased support by about 12 percentage points compared to no changes in the number of jobs. So this was an attribute that people were choosing on, that this was, came out as particularly important. And then the next category that I'd like to highlight that I think is particularly interesting is ownership. And this is something I've started to do a little bit more work on, community ownership of energy systems, particularly solar in Canada has been a little bit of a new research area for me, not since this, but I started to get interested in how people perceive ownership. So holding a US or an American private company as the baseline compared to that, which pretty much is the norm, in the States for a company who's building out one of these large projects. People prefer projects that are community owned, which was an exciting result for me to see. And it's actually by the largest margin, respondents in the sample are less likely to support projects that are owned by foreign private companies, which I think is also quite interesting because it has a lot of kind of messaging implications, and we're seeing that a lot kind of come up now. And I think there are kind of more negative readings of it, but I think one way that I read it is that people want money to stay in their community, which I think is a thing that we kind of can do with energy transitions. Finally, I will talk about the type of technology, right? Because we talked about, we included nuclear power plants, large-scale solar, large-scale onshore wind, and then held as a reference category natural gas with carbon capture and storage. And pretty much solar came out as a big winner, with people 7 percentage points more likely in the state to choose solar, which was exciting, but stands in contrast, right, to what we're seeing around these individual projects being opposed. People were less likely to choose nuclear, which, in terms of thinking about how generalizable this might be to the rest of the US, it's possible that people are kind of more risk averse to nuclear in Pennsylvania because of the history, but we didn't ask why, but interesting to note. The next part that was particularly exciting to me about this research, and has been something that I've been really thrilled to get to talk about, is that we see a bipartisan alignment, and a lot of them are around these benefits. We don't see too many huge differences between the things that Republicans and Democrats in the US value, Republicans being on the more on the farther right, Democrats on the left, for people not consumed by US politics. The two things where they differ are in the community ownership aspect and the type, and it's just a little bit. Also a note is that these are not average marginal component effects. These are marginal means, which are descriptive, not causal. They're group averages. They're not compared to a baseline. But then we can look at the differences between these group means. And so we see in the community ownership side, it's Democrats that are more kind of interested in community ownership. Republicans are more likely to support a project that's owned by an American private company, and Democrats are less likely to pick nuclear than Republicans. But in terms of jobs, like these are things that are important to everybody in terms of other types of community benefits, which I think is quite interesting and not necessarily aligned with the narrative that we tend to hear about partisan division on climate policy. So now the really exciting stuff. We looked at what mattered to local elected officials. First, I will look at their preferences, and then I will show you how they perceived their constituents' preferences. Notice that this was a much smaller sample size, so we have these larger error bars, but I think it's still a pretty great thing to be able to get 200 local elected officials in Pennsylvania. The place where they seem to really align with their constituents, but even more in a more extreme way, is that foreign ownership was associated with a decrease in support for projects. And where they really differ, and I think is really important, is that elected officials were most likely to prefer natural gas with carbon capture and storage, and there was a statistically significant decrease in support associated with wind and solar. So across these attributes, we also asked them the two questions for each one: which do you pick, and then which do you think that your constituents would pick? They seem to think that they have the same preferences as their constituents. They're aware of this distrust in foreign companies, but to me the most interesting finding is that they underestimate resident concern about jobs, and they underestimate support for solar. And this is the piece where I think that we start getting to why that disconnect. Why are we seeing this local opposition? And I'll speculate about that a little bit, but I think it's a kind of really important piece. And so before I talk a little bit about where this research is headed, I think some of the kind of top level takeaways from this were that these direct benefits, so things like job creation, community ownership, increased public support for large scale energy projects. So I think this is no surprise that community benefits are important. But it's something that I think needs to be stressed a bit more. How energy transitions can be opportunities for communities, can help communities do better, rather than being associated with having something to lose. The bipartisan support, we saw that support is similar across political parties in the general public, and I think this suggests this opportunity for bipartisan efforts around these community benefits. So this is a good way to get people on board. We saw that elected officials underestimate how much their constituents support projects that generate solar and create permanent jobs. I think this is really important. And I point to this last point that I think where do we go from here is around open dialogue. One thing people have been asking me quite a bit is why? Why do elected officials not understand what their constituents want? Isn't that their job? Yes, and I didn't exactly study why, but I have some hypotheses. I do think that opposition tends to be louder than support. You saw that full room in coming out in opposition to a project. We don't typically show up to things that we're just kind of okay with to say like, you know, sounds good. And if projects are not doing a lot in the way of community benefits, then they're also not generating that kind of support where people really do have something to gain and people with something to lose are much more likely to show up. I think it's worth mentioning that there are absolutely targeted misinformation campaigns that target local elected officials to obscure the fact that renewable energy is broadly popular because there are lots of interests in Pennsylvania, lots of interests in the state that stand to lose money from that. So I think that's not surprising as well. And we didn't study that, but there is lots of other good kind of research on there about or out there about misinformation that I think can kind of contribute to this and other ways of maybe looking at it. So yeah, I was excited to do that study, excited to kind of talk about it right now in the midst of the election and kind of think about how community benefits are being represented. Ooh, okay, I will go a little bit. So what about community benefits? And this is a recent study out of the Lawrence Berkeley labs, and I think is pretty interesting. Just like I got a cool sample, they got a great sample of project developers and asked, it's a big report. If you Google it, there's, they asked lots and lots of things, but they asked about community benefits and they asked about community benefits agreements. And according to developers, community ownership and electricity bill discounts are not very feasible. They said that increasing community benefits payments are somewhat feasible, but community ownership, that was one thing that increased support in the sample that I saw. So I've been thinking a lot about community benefits agreements and just other project agreements and what we might do to kind of move the needle on this. Community benefits agreements or CBAs basically, set a legal precedent and a guarantee for certain local benefits. These can very much differ by project, but things like jobs, things like improved infrastructure to garner project support. There are kind of a whole host. There are, in the US now, we have a lot of community benefits plans, which are non-binding, and then, compared to community benefits agreements, which are supposed to be binding, but there are also project labor agreements, community workforce agreements. But we know little systematically about CBAs, how they might be expanded, reimagined, kind of thought about a little bit creatively, and it feels like a little bit of a missed opportunity to me to incentivize these equitable outcomes, and something that I've been thinking about. How do we realize them? I think that these, like we saw from the survey research, I think that these community benefits have the opportunity to act as leverage points, but also kind of encourage a bit more equity in the development process, which is not always the main concern. So I think other work has found that community benefits can move towards addressing local harms, concentrating, clarifying, and guaranteeing community benefits, and increasing trust in the siting process. Data for Progress and the World Resources Institute ran a survey and found all kinds of things that voters really liked in community benefits agreements. And they also looked at, who they trust, who they trusted to negotiate on behalf of their community. People like small business owners, community leaders, local nonprofits. So they're like elected officials are kind of down towards the end of people they trust, as are developers of these projects, right? So thinking about, well, who's actually negotiating these benefits. And so the kind of work that I'm doing now, and I welcome questions about it. I didn't put too much in it because I don't have too much more time, but is thinking about, well, how do we do this? And so I'm excited that my team was selected for a US Department of Energy SEEDS project that's focused specifically on siting large-scale solar. The project is called Developing an Infrastructure of Trust. a social science approach to building community acceptance of large-scale solar in the US. It's a relatively large team over 3 years that we're doing both quantitative and qualitative work across the US, including a review of community benefits agreements and associated project agreements, a content analysis of what are in CBAs, both for renewable energy and beyond, to try to think a little bit more creatively about, well, what could be in them. We'll be doing more public and local elected official surveys. And what I'm very excited about is some stakeholder workshops to see if we can kind of work on this issue of trust and alignment around community benefits, ending with some in-depth case studies. And what we hope to create out of this is really some toolkits for how can communities co-create CBAs across different types of stakeholders that are involved in the process. And so so it's a little bit less piecemeal, and there are some guidelines. I think that often it's very difficult to know what to ask for. Like when you are negotiating your offer letter at a new job, it's a lot easier to know what to ask for when you know what other people got. So I think the same is true about community benefits. When we have kind of a little bit more of a systematic understanding of what they can do, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to think about how they're used. And so with that, thank you. That just goes to my website, but super happy to chat and take questions about any of it. Thank you. Yeah, I'll go back to the main. Yes, this average marginal component effect. Not that I know of, because they're all randomized and then held to a baseline. So you're kind of looking at everything compared to what that baseline was. So yeah. I'm supposed to. No, I'm supposed to repeat your question, which the question was, can you look at different attributes synergistically together? To which I said, not particularly. I think yes. I think a project with more community benefits would probably be more attractive, and you can make some assumptions based on the increases in levels of support. That if all of the things that are valued most highly are bundled together, it's probably you're more likely to choose that project. Yeah, that's a great question. The question was, how is the question phrased? Asking elected officials how they perceived their constituents' preferences. Do we think that was well represented? I think it's always an issue with survey research, right? And anything that's self-reported, you don't exactly know why people are answering it the way that they are. I do think that this has more external validity than asking, do you support a project that creates jobs? Yes or no. They saw the same thing as the sample of the general public, and then there was just 2 questions. It was, and if you download like the supplementary stuff in the paper, I think we put all the survey stuff in there. I'm very pro making all of the stuff reproducible so that people can go try to look at it again. But I think we asked, which project do you support? And just pretty simply, which project do you think most of your constituents support? Mhm. That's a great question. The question was, had the attributes to compare been different? Had we talked about other kinds of solar, what would we expect the large scale results? I think that's right. I think that people that it is generally more palatable, right? You hear that quite a bit. Like, well, we want it on roofs, we want it on we want solar and on brownfields on, which is something that you hear. And I think that when I talk to people, it's always a both end, right? It's like, oh, what to what end, how much energy can we generate? But I think, yes, I think it would have been less popular than other forms. And I think the other kind of interesting thing to note to that point in Pennsylvania that I've talked to some planners about is that it's just the kind of perception of why are we losing farmland? And when you see a lot of solar, I think there can be that kind of perception like, well, we're losing farmland to solar, when really there's just so much external development pressure in the region. And so where I was mostly, the survey is in the whole state, but where I was mostly doing field work was in South Central Pennsylvania, kind of by the Maryland border. And it's right off the I-95 corridor, which goes across the whole US. And so is also a really opportune place for warehousing for shipping. And so I think we're also seeing a lot of loss of farmland to these other types of land uses. So then when you ask people like, well, would you prefer a solar farm or a big warehouse? That answer also changes. But yeah, it's a great question. Yep. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Mhm. Yeah, this is great. The question was, how much room is there to really influence the design of the projects around the jobs category? Or, can it just be an easy marketing win to say like economic will create jobs? Because I think it's absolutely a risk, right? Like, and I think that false promises that aren't delivered on then actually do quite a bit to hurt trust and credibility. And I think that is one of the things that we're looking at in the seeds proposal. Kind of, I think people probably are more likely to be distrustful if they feel that they have a reason to, right? If if a promise wasn't delivered on before. So I'm interested in these like project labor agreements and community benefits agreements to see what comes up around job creation, because I'm not really sure. Like I've heard a lot of just the rhetoric and not or a lot of the like modeling studies of opportunity for job creation and a little bit less on like what how many jobs an individual project creates, rather than like if you say like green energy, and people can kind of like model those number of jobs. So I think it's an interesting point. The other thing I'll note is that in my qualitative work in Pennsylvania, I spent a lot of time talking with labor organizers. And this is for another paper that I'm still writing, that one day qualitative work always takes me so much longer. But a lot of the labor organizers that I talked to, it sounded like they were really on board and had really like positive conversations with developers. And then the kind of like communication and clarity and timelines weren't there, where there's a lot of just uncertainty in the timelines around building projects, particularly when it comes to being in the interconnection queue, like when you can as a project get hooked up to the grid, and how much uncertainty developers face with, are we actually going to get this signed off on by the board? Can we build it? And so they aren't able to kind of make, or they don't feel they're able to make those promises about like, okay, like we'll work with the electrical workers to say, like, these are going to be your jobs. They want to know, with enough time to be able to recruit and train and build their programs. And then when it comes down to it, often it seems like just like a scramble of like, okay, well, the project got through, like now we have to hire people, and like they can be from anywhere. So I think that there's a lot of work to do on that end to kind of align in terms of not just like aggregate number of jobs, but like number of jobs in a community or number of, high paying union jobs versus, kind of like hourly temporary wage jobs that end up like, not being like great for people. Thank you. The question was about the discrepancies between stakeholder perceptions and actual constituent beliefs and what the kind of political implications are. And I think to your question about communicating the discrepancies, I think one really nice thing to the company that did the local elected official survey called Civic Pulse, I think they do so well, and they have a really great response rate where it's something like 80% of people that take one of their surveys will take another one. And that's because they do a really great job of communicating with the community. So like part of their kind of mandate, what they're trying to do is also use this to give local elected officials and politicians in general more information, right? So we actually wrote a very short report just after the survey kind of about that they sent out to all of their people. So I am hopeful that, some of that there is communication that can happen. But I think really at the local level, we need to think a lot more carefully about how we talk about energy transitions and at what timescales. I think that the norm is talking about a specific project when that project is proposed, or really maybe, and as most people feel and often rightfully feel, after that project has essentially already been decided on, how that plan has gone, as opposed to thinking a little bit more proactively about what, as a community, are our priorities, what do we want energy transitions to help us do, and how can we try to attract developers in a little bit of a more coordinated way that we think will help us with the things that we actually want to get done. And I think that like that's it's a very difficult process. Like when you think about just like municipalities in general across rural parts of the state, maybe they have one planner who's kind of doing everything. They don't have somebody who's just doing energy. I think it's absolutely not an easy job, but something that, yeah, I've been thinking about more broadly. So I think there are political implications. And yeah, but I think there are some good political implications too in terms of what kind of bipartisan support community benefits might help to achieve. Yeah, this is a great question around how we chose the baselines for the study. And so one thing to note is that what people actually saw looked like this. And so they weren't choosing as compared to a baseline. They were choosing something that was randomized. The baselines are for analysis purposes. So we represent them. So I can change the baselines and I can present it in a different way. I could as part of the analysis, you can kind of pick which baseline. So these are the baselines that we chose for analysis purposes, but you could recalculate them. So I think it's useful to think about. There are also some, in terms of like best practices in conjoint experiments, there are some models for where you could look at like how to choose statistically the baseline. But what we did was think about what we thought kind of like made the most sense for presentation purposes. And so, yeah, so in Pennsylvania, the kind of developer, private owned model is the most, the most mainstream. So that's what we kind of held as the baseline. But it's a great question because it does have implications for how the results are presented. Yes. Yeah, there's a question about, are there studies about who shows up to community meetings? I believe there are. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I feel like I have read some. From my anecdotal experience in South Central Pennsylvania of going to some of them, it actually is a lot of kind of, relatively well-off retired families, people. And like you think of, I think it's useful to say because of like who has more time, more kind of mental space to devote to that, and also more stake in the game in terms of real estate prices, people who own homes, where there's also been some really great studies that solar, about how solar impacts property values. And there's one new one that was like a pretty large one using Zillow data that showed that like actually solar was associated with a very small increase in property values. So for whatever that's worth, but I think that there's the perception that property values can be negatively impacted. And so you often have people, with a stake in the game, and those people tend to, have a more privileged position to begin with. So I think it's important to note, and one of my kind of hopeful takeaways from this is that like local participation matters, that it is probably the best way to make your voice heard. We're doing some work looking at state testimonies with Maddie is here, and we were saying like in a lot of states you can actually like your testimony will be put online, like it exists, it is out there, it is a thing that hopefully local elected officials look at and maybe can move towards changing some of those perceptions when they're seeing a high volume of emails in support of certain things or in opposition to others. Yes, I think, and then I think we're at time. Okay. Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't have it in here, but in the paper, we have all the sociodemographics. It was a representative sample of the state based on census data. And then we used post-stratification weights to make it more representative if it wasn't. But we also, in the supplemental materials, we do some subgroup analyses and look at like the differences between income or between age. And so there are kind of some interesting points, which I think, yes, the sociodemographics definitely reflect that. Well, thank you everybody so much for coming. It was a joy to get to talk about this and hope to connect with many of you in the future.